Hello and welcome to the Silver King's War. I'm Michael Sievers, the writer, producer, and creator of this podcast series about my father's Second World War as a B-26 bombardier. Today we are in a special episode of the Silver King's War. This episode is devoted to the history of the Queen Mary, the ship that the Silver King rode to his war over the Atlantic Ocean in late September of 1944. As the King's son and narrator, I thought it was important to share with you, the King's faithful followers, a bit of the history of the Queen Mary. And significantly, this episode first published in April of 2022. The Queen Mary was ordered in April of 1929. That's 93 years ago. The Silver King, born on April 23rd of 1923, would have been 99 later this month. He died in October of 1990 at 67. Stanley, our incredible and faithful scribe of his years during the war, was 21 when he rode the Queen Mary to Southampton. He loved the journey and wrote descriptively about it to his family just as he arrived in England. The Queen Mary's history began as a competition. Germany was launching Bremen and Europa, and Britain didn't want to be left behind in this shipbuilding adventure. The White Star Line began construction of a ship called the Oceanic in 1928, and Cunard had planned a ship of about 75,000 tons. That ship became the Queen Mary, whose maiden voyage was on May 27th, 1936. And it was an ocean liner. It had 12 decks. It was capable of reaching 32 miles per hour, with a capacity of over 2,100 passengers and a crew of 1,100. It became known as the RMS Queen Mary. The RMS acronym was for Royal Mail Ship because the ship provided, under contract, services for sorting mail on board throughout the journey. Construction began in December of 1930 on the River Clyde by the John Brown Company shipyard, and that was at Clydebank in Scotland. But the work stopped in December of 1931 because of the Great Depression, and at that time the Cunard Line applied to the British government for a loan to complete the ship. The government granted the loan with enough money to complete the ship and to build a running mate for it, with the intention of providing a 2-ship weekly service to New York. A condition of the loan was that Cunard would merge with the White Star Line, another struggling British shipping company, which happened to be Cunard's chief rival at that time, and had also been forced by the Depression to stop the construction of the Oceanic. The lines agreed to merge, and that was completed in May of 1934. The John Brown Company completed the Queen Mary in 3.5 years, and its cost is equivalent to $338 million in 2020. The ship was named after Mary of Teck, who was the consort of King George V, and until the ship's launch, the name was kept secret. Part of the legend has it that the Cunard intended to name the ship Victoria, in keeping with a tradition of the shipping line. But when the company representatives asked the king's permission to name the ocean liner after Britain's greatest queen, he said that his wife, Mary of Teck, would be delighted. And so, the legend continued, the delegation had no other choice but to call the ship the Queen Mary. The Queen Mary was fitted with 24 Yarrow boilers in 4 boiler rooms and 4 Parsons turbines in 2 engine rooms. The boilers delivered 400 pounds per square inch steam at 700 degrees Fahrenheit. These turbines provided to 4 propellers the power that turned each of them at 200 revolutions per minute. That power allowed the Queen Mary to reach almost 33 knots during her acceptance trials in early 1936. The ship's interior included 2 indoor swimming pools, beauty salons, libraries, and children's nurseries for 3 classes of travelers on the ship. It included a music studio and lecture hall, telephone connections to anywhere in the world, outdoor tennis courts, and dog kennels. The largest room on board was cabin class for the first class, which included a main dining room and a grand salon, which spanned 3 stories in height. And the Queen Mary was the first ocean liner equipped with a separate Jewish prayer room as part of their policy to show that the shipping lines were not part of the anti-Semitism movement underway in Europe. The cabin-class main dining room included a large map of the transatlantic crossing with twin tracks that showed the winter-spring route to avoid the icebergs and, of course, the summer-autumn route. And during each crossing, there was a motorized model of the Queen Mary that showed the vessel's progress over the ocean. As an alternative to the main dining room, the Queen Mary included a separate cabin-class veranda grill on the sun deck at the upper aft of the ship. The grill was an exclusive a la carte restaurant with a capacity for about 80 passengers, and it was converted each night to the Starlight Club. And there was the observation bar, which was an Art Deco-styled lounge with wide ocean views. In late August 1939, the Queen Mary was on a return trip from New York to Southampton. The international situation led to her being escorted by the battleship cruiser HMS Hood. The ship arrived safely and began to return for New York on the 1st of September. When the Queen Mary arrived in New York Harbor, war was underway, and she was ordered to remain in port alongside the Normandy until further notice. In March of 1940, the Queen Mary and Normandy were joined in New York Harbor by Queen Mary's new running mate, the Queen Elizabeth, which was just off a secret voyage from Clydebank. The 3 largest liners in the world sat idle until the Allied commanders decided that all 3 ships could be used for troop transports. The Normandy was destroyed by fire during her troopship conversion, and the Queen Mary left New York for Sydney, Australia, where she, along with other liners, were converted into troop ships to carry Australian and New Zealand soldiers to the United Kingdom. In the Second World War conversion, the ship's hull, superstructure, and funnels were painted navy gray, and with the new color, in combination with great speed, the Queen Mary became known as the Gray Ghost. To protect against magnetic mines, a degaussing coil was fitted around the outside of the hull. Inside, stateroom furniture and decorations were removed and replaced with triple-tiered wooden bunks, which were later replaced by standee or fold-up bunks. A total of 6 miles of carpet, 220 cases of china, crystal, and silver service, tapestries, and paintings were removed and stored in warehouses throughout the war. The woodwork in the staterooms, the cabin-class dining room, and other public areas were covered with leather. The Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth were the largest and fastest troop ships during the war, often carrying as many as 15,000 men in a single trip. The ship's high speed and zigzag courses made it virtually impossible for the German U-boats to catch them. During the week of July 25, 1943, the Queen Mary carried 15,740 soldiers and 943 crew, which became a record for the most passengers ever transported on one vessel. And this was only possible in summer, as passengers, of course, had to sleep on deck. During the war, the Queen Mary carried British Prime Minister Winston Churchill across the Atlantic for meetings with Allied officials on several occasions, and on each he was listed on the passenger manifest as Colonel Warden. After the war, from September of 1946 to July of 1947, the Queen Mary was refitted for passenger service. After their respective retrofittings to follow the war, both queens, Mary and Elizabeth, dominated transatlantic passenger trips through the Cunard White Star's two-ship weekly express service that served passengers throughout the 1940s and into the 1950s. They were highly profitable ships, and Cunard became a separate company in 1947. A decade later, in 1958, the first transatlantic jet flight began to change the way people traveled, and the competition was fierce for the Cunard Queens. With New York to London travel time of 7 or 8 hours, it was now possible to reach a different continent during one day, and the demand for sea crossing on ocean liners began to shrink. During the winter, there were times when the Queen Mary might sail into harbor with more crew than passengers. By the mid-1960s, the Cunard fleet was operating at a loss. Cunard was building the Queen Elizabeth II in the mid-60s and decided to mortgage most of its fleet because of a combination of age and lack of interest and an inefficient market. They decided that they would retire both the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth from service. The Queen Mary retired from service in 1967. On September 27th, she finished her 1,000th and final crossing of the North Atlantic, having carried over 2 million passengers and covered almost 4 million miles. She sailed from Southampton for the last time on October 31st with 1,093 passengers and 806 crew, and after a voyage around Cape Horn, she arrived in Long Beach, California on December 9th. Today, in Long Beach Harbor, the Queen Mary is a permanent tourist attraction, hotel, and museum. As we conclude the 3-decade arc of the Queen Mary's life as an ocean liner, it's really a pleasure for me to reflect on the journey that Kelly and I made on the Queen Mary II in October of 2018. The II is a beautiful ship, and in doing the research on the original Queen Mary, of course, it's a pleasure also to reflect on the joy we shared over a week of the Atlantic crossing. The design, the detail, the quality of the work, the service, the staff, the entire experience of the Queen Mary II is something that we will always remember. Much like our hero, the Silver King, recalled his journey on the Queen Mary, covering the Atlantic crossing in September of 1944. And you are listening to the Silver King's War.